Everybody. Delighted to have so many of you participating. I'd just like to welcome you all, especially because it is Charity Trustees Week, and this week is about recognising the contribution that you and other charity trustees make to the charity sector in Ireland. You are the lifeblood of the sector, and there wouldn't be a charity sector without you. I hope that in general you find it interesting and rewarding being a charity trustee. I suspect that you find it at times challenging, and we are certainly aware of that here in the Charities Regulator. But another part of this week is about reminding you that there is support there for you in the general sense from ourselves and from other organisations. For the Charities Regulator, obviously being the responsible for supervising compliance with the Charities Act, it is at times a little bit more difficult, but we do provide support as well. And we do this in how we engage with charities on a one-to-one basis and charity trustees where there is an issue, but also through the materials that we provide on our website and through seminars and webinars like this. We have added to our website and we've changed things up in the last few months. So if you haven't visited the website in some time, I'd suggest that you take a look again and see the broad range of materials that we have there that should be of assistance to you in dealing with some of the more challenging aspects of your role. Classification, the classification standard, this is, I suppose, the official launch, you could say, of it. It's not the first you've heard of it because we have mentioned it since last year, in fact, and we did consult with you earlier this year, and we appreciate all of the feedback that we got as part of that consultation process, which helped us in finalising the standard. Mandy is going to take you through the detail of it now very shortly. But I suppose what I wanted to say was I hope you don't just see this as another piece of homework from the Charities Regulator, because certainly that's not what is intended. I hope that once you've even been through this webinar, that you will see that it is actually a very simple and straightforward process to complete the standard. Probably the most difficult part or the most time consuming will be as you sit around as a board of trustees and you decide on what categorization best describes the outcomes achieved or intended to be achieved by you when you carry out your activities. But there's another way that we see the classification standard, and that is that it will be of benefit to you in charities because it will provide you with the means of putting yourself forward, putting your charity forward for funding, for individual donations, for maybe legacy bequests, for volunteers, or indeed for opportunities to collaborate and cooperate with other charities. And this is because by having a standard whereby we can explain the categories of charities in a simple, straightforward way, other people using the register can look up what charities are operating in that sector. And in a way that wouldn't have been possible before, they can locate and identify your charity and consider making one of those contributions to it. So we see it as very much a positive development, and we hope that you will too. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mandy, who's going to take you through the standard and how to complete the form. Thank you. Mandy?
Hello everyone, just bear with me a moment now. I'm just going to share my screen with you all today. Okay, I hope you're seeing my first slide there. Okay, well, as Madeleine and Ger said, my name is Mandy Osborne and I'm the research manager here in the Charities Regulator. It's great to see so many of you with us today for the webinar, and I hope you'll find it useful. I'll be covering what charity classification is and why it's important, and I'll also try to give you some tips and examples which should help your charity decide where it fits into the classification. I also hope after the session that you'll feel informed enough to have a classification discussion with the trustees and then submit the online form. We would really encourage charities to do this sooner rather than later, because the more charities which submit their classification, the more useful the data becomes. I'll probably touch again on some of the points which Madeleine has already made, but if I'm repeating them, it's because it's important. And if you have any questions as we go through the session, you can pop them into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before we finish up today. So I suppose to start off, what is classification? For some reason my slide is not, here we go. Okay, so classification is simply the division of people or things into categories which are determined by their shared qualities or characteristics. We all classify things every day, very often without thinking about it. We talk about crime thrillers, we talk about Jack Russell Terriers, we talk about city dwellers, renewable energy. Even deciding whether something goes in the green bin or the waste bin is an example of classification. So it's with us all day, every day. So why do we think classification of charities is important? Well, the whole aim of introducing a charity classification standard is to improve the information which is available about registered charities in Ireland. For example, it's not currently possible on the register to accurately or comprehensively identify or group charities with similar activities, such as those working in the mental health area or operating internationally or running a community or resource centre. And being able to do this will not only provide clarity for research and comparison purposes, but will also help guide funders and policymakers in assessing the charity sector and will facilitate collaboration and knowledge sharing amongst charities in Ireland. However, it is important to point out that classification is not an exact science, and there is no perfect classification method in any field. We know that some charities, particularly those with multiple charitable purposes or a very wide range of activities, will not neatly fit into the classification which we have developed. So there will be compromises to be made by these charities when determining the most appropriate categories. But all we really need is a best fit, which is reasonable and not misleading. So I just give you a little bit of background now. The standards, as Madeleine mentioned, went through a fairly lengthy development process, which included consultation with stakeholders such as charity representative bodies, government departments and researchers, as well as charities themselves and the general public. The final standard was approved by the Board of the Charities Regulator in May, and a period of IT development followed that, and the online form is now available for you to complete and submit. We've also developed guidance documents and some FAQs to assist you through the process. I will be giving you a preview of the form and details about where you can find the resources later on in the webinar. So what about our classification? Well, firstly, it was important to ensure that it was easy to understand. So we've used common terms and descriptions where possible. Some categories will seem very generalised, while others are more specific. But overall, we believe that it is structured in such a way that it will enable every charity to find a best fit. The standard broadly mirrors international classification standards, in particular the International Classification of Non-Profit and Third Sector Organisations, which is used as the basis of charity classification in over 45 countries worldwide. This means that data on Irish charities should be easily compared to that of charities in other jurisdictions. The classification is designed to reflect that many charities work in a variety of ways to deliver on their charitable purpose. However, choices within the classification are limited. Charities will only be able to select up to 2 from a list of 10 primary groups and then up to 2 additional sub-classifications under each. The benefit of this limitation is that the resulting data will be more meaningful, accurate and concise, as it will be based on an informed choice rather than the "I'd better tick that as well just in case" approach, which I think we're all very familiar with. I must stress though, and I can't stress this enough, that although a charity is restricted in the number of categories it can choose in the classification, this does not limit the types of activities which a charity can undertake to further its charitable purpose. And the activities section of the annual report to the regulator, which is published on the Register of Charities, will continue to provide an opportunity for charities to elaborate on the diversity of their operations. So as I mentioned, there are 10 primary groups. There should be something here for every charity, and charities can pick up to 2 of these groups. You'll notice that community appears in a couple of the groups. I'm sure you're aware of this already, but there's no harm in a reminder that when we use the term community, we don't just mean a specific geographical location or area. It can also refer to a group of people with common experiences or a shared interest or purpose, for example, the deaf community or the farming community. Another thing just to note is that if your charity primarily carries out its activities overseas, then Group 10, international activities, should be one of your choices. As mentioned, every primary group has secondary groups. In this example, you can see that the primary group, arts and culture, has been broken out into 3 secondary categories: arts, history, heritage and culture, and museum or library. And a charity can pick up to 2 of these. Every primary group has secondary categories, and most, but not all, of the secondary categories have subgroups. This example shows the subgroups in the secondary group, history, heritage and culture. Arts also has a number of subgroups, not shown here, but museum and library has none. Subgroups are available where it was considered that the group was very broad and more subdivision was necessary. And if there are subgroups, again, charities can choose up to 2. So I suppose I'll sort of explain that a little bit more later when you actually see the form. But what are we asking charities to do now? Well, the first step is for the charity trustees to consider and agree on the most appropriate classification for their charity. For some charities, there will be very little decision making required. It'll only be fairly obvious which category the charity fills into. Other charities, it will require more discussion and consideration, and I'm sure quite a few debates as well. When considering how to classify their charity, the trustees should review the charitable purposes for which they were approved when registered as a charity, the main object, the activities of the charity, and the financial expenditure, including staff and administration costs on those activities. So let's think now for a moment about how all these fit together and how they can be used to determine classification. When a charity is first registered, it is approved for one or more of the charitable purposes set out in the Charities Act 2009. This could be advancement of education, advancement of religion, promotion of health, etc. So that's the first pointer. What charitable purpose or purposes has the charity been approved for? And is there a primary classification, category in the classification which clearly fits? For example, a charity which has a charitable purpose of the promotion of health, including the prevention or the relief of sickness, disease, or human suffering, may only need to look at the categories in the primary group health and care services to find their best fit. The next thing to consider is the main object of the charity. As you know, this is set out in the governing document and it describes what the charity is set up to achieve and how it will go about achieving it. The main object is directly linked to the charitable purpose and is probably the best guide to determining classification. For example, a charity with a main object which states that it advances education by providing books and other educational materials to schools for street children in Mumbai has a very clear steer to 2 primary groups: education and research, and international activities. The range of the activities of the charity and the expenditure on those activities, excluding obviously salary and administration costs, could also be important when it comes to classification. This may be more relevant in larger charities or in those with multiple charitable purposes. In a case where a charity falls equally into more than 2 primary or secondary groups in the classification, then the main activities and the expenditure on those activities could be used as a deciding factor, but this will obviously be up to individual trustees to agree. Trustees must also be conscious that it is not the mechanism of delivery which should determine the classification. Instead, they should focus on the objective of the charity and the public benefit which is being provided. For example, here, a number of charities use sport as the medium to deliver on their charitable purpose. But sport isn't a category in the classification because the charitable purpose and public benefit being delivered by those charities is not sport itself, which isn't a charitable purpose anyway, but could be, for example, promoting social inclusion for people with disabilities or promoting health. So looking at all of these things in the round, the purposes, the main object, the activities and the expenditure, and keeping in mind that all that is required is a best fit, should help guide the charities trustees to the most appropriate classifications for their charity. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. In this first example, the charity provides a community food bank, and it fits nicely into primary group 1, social and community services, with a secondary group of provision of food or other vital goods or services. And I think you'll agree that that's perfectly adequately categorised. In this next example, the charity carries out a variety of activities to further their charitable purpose of the prevention or relief of suffering of animals. They have a dog and cat rescue and rehoming service, a donkey sanctuary and veterinary clinic, and they also give talks to schools about pet care and welfare. This charity clearly falls into the primary classification of environment and animals with a secondary group of animal welfare. However, You will recall that I said that many of the secondary categories are further broken down into subgroups. The secondary group animal welfare has 4 subgroups: rescue, rehabilitation or rehoming, animal sanctuary shelter, veterinary services, and animal care and welfare education. All of these would be appropriate choices for this charity. However, a charity can only select up to 2 subcategories, so the trustees need to agree what is their best fit. I'm sure in some charities the trustees will struggle to reach a consensus, but if they keep in mind the classification is not intended to be a comprehensive list of everything the charity does and only an overview of the main areas of activity, and all that is needed is a best fit, they should be able to come to an agreement. Along with considering the charitable purpose, main object, current activities, and perhaps thinking back about the history and development of the charity might help too. What were the initial priorities when the charity was first set up? It might also be useful to think about what would you do if you were forced to cut back. What activity would you give up first? This might be an indication that it's not quite as important as some of the other activities. This kind of approach should provide some pointers to the best fit. In some cases, it may also be that a very general classification is the best fit. For example, a charity which is a religious order would very likely not just be involved in advancing religion through worship and ministry, but would probably carry out a very diverse range of activities within the education, health, or community service areas as well. So perhaps their best option would be to keep it simple and choose just a single primary group of religion and the secondary group religious orders, societies, monastics, or other religious community, and nothing more for their classification. In this next example, the charity supports adults with intellectual disabilities to access education and training. They have a single charitable purpose of the advancement of education, so this points them in the first instance to the primary group, education and research, with a secondary group of education supports and student services. This classification is reasonable, but remember that charities can select up to 2 groups, a second primary group if they wish. So let's stay with the same charity and see what other options they may have. So looking again at what they do, while advancement of education is their only charitable purpose, their services are focused on a particular group of beneficiaries, people with intellectual disabilities. So this charity could also choose social and community services as a primary group and select the most relevant subgroups from this category. For example, services to people with an intellectual disability and working to remove barriers to inclusion would seem to be a good fit. You'll notice I've posed a question at the bottom of this slide, which is the most important primary group, or are both equal? When completing the online form, charities which choose 2 primary groups will be asked to indicate if their second choice is less relevant than the first, or if both are of equal importance. This question is being asked for data analysis purposes in the future. For example, a researcher may only want to use data from charities where education and research was either the only category or where it was the most important category, rather than from all charities which included it in their classification. So you notice here I pose a question: is your charity a state body? When you're completing the online classification form, we will also ask you to confirm if the charity is a state body. That is, an organisation formed by statute or act. A state body may also be known as a statutory body or a state agency. And just to be very clear on this point, a charity may be funded entirely by central or local government, but this does not make it a state body. A state body must be established by statute or an act of government. There are only a few charities which are state bodies, so for the vast majority of charities, the response to this question on the form will be no. You may be wondering why we're asking this. Well, the economic weight of these few charities is considerable. They also have a high number of employees and generally very few volunteers. Many are also the primary funders of a significant number of other charities. Any of these factors could have an impact when carrying out research on the sector, so we thought it important that any charity which is also a state body is easily identifiable. So what are we asking charities to do now? Well, firstly, decide on the classification groups for the charity. Once this is agreed, the next step is to log in and to complete and submit the form. The form is very straightforward and should only take a couple of minutes to complete, as I'll demonstrate shortly. Submission of the form will be a once-off process for charities, unless the charity, of course, wants to amend it in future, and it will automatically register. There's no back office checking process the first time we lodge the form, and the classification will be published immediately onto the Register of Charities. So now we're at demo time. So if you just bear with me a moment, I'm just going to stop sharing this screen and move on to the demonstration system. So just bear with me.
Mandy, while you're getting that, I'll just say that we're actually joined by Michael Feeney, who's a sign language interpreter. So if anybody needs a little bit of extra support, if they might just pin Michael's screen. So that's Michael Feeney.
Okay. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so now what you should be seeing is those of you who are used to logging into my account, the online portal, this is the opening screen, and I'm just going to go into, I have a number of charities here, and I'm just going to open one of these charities, and it will open to the left-hand side, or the right-hand side of the screen, all of the forms. If it works, it's a little bit slow here at the moment. There we go. And the charity classification form is currently at the bottom of the list, even though it would be one of the first alphabetically. So it's charity classification and continue. And this will then open the form. Now it's a very straightforward form, as I mentioned. There are literally 3 tabs. The first tab on the form is just an introduction tab, and it's essentially a summary of the material included in the user guide. And it's really there just to help you through the form. If you've come prepared, and you obviously have all, and you should have decided all your classification before you attempt to fill in the form, you just probably ignore this. So I'm just going to show you how to move on. You can either move on by clicking the second tab here at the top, or at the bottom of the form, you can use the next button. This will open the main details tab, and this is really where the bones of the classification is entered. So you'll see there that the first question is your charity a state body? I'm going to say no, because my charity that I'm using for my example isn't. And I'm going to use the examples we had earlier, the charity which advances education by supporting adults with intellectual disabilities. So the first thing I'm going to say here is select my first primary classification. Clicking on the down arrow brings up a list of the 10 primary classifications. So I am going to click on Education and Research. A little bit more information appears below. It's telling me that it's most compatible with operations which further charitable purposes of advancement of education. Again, that's just there as a reminder. If you want some more information, there's a tick box. You can tick on the tick box and it populates information about the various, and some examples about the various types of organizations falling into this group. Untick the box to hide it again. This category, as I say, every primary category has secondary classifications, so it's now allowing me to select up to 2 secondary classifications. So I'm going to select education supports. None of the rest of those particularly fit my charity, but if they did, I would complete them. Education supports just happens to be one which has some subclassifications, and it's allowing me again to pick up to 2 of those. And in this case, of the list which appears, student services there is the most appropriate. So that is my first and my primary classification selected. The system then gives me the option to select another primary classification if it's relevant for my charity. It may not be relevant, and if it's not relevant, I'm just continuing to next. You will notice that there's no red star on this. This means it's not a mandatory question, so you can continue without completing it. Red star means mandatory. And anything with an I symbol appears on the public register. So in my case, I'm going to select a secondary group because my charity supports people with intellectual disabilities. So I'm going to go into social and community services because I know that's where those categories are. Same thing again, it has the tick box for more information. Select up to 2 primary classifications under this. So I'm going to take social inclusion supports, resources and supports. And I'm also going to take, under this one, working to remove barriers to inclusion. Now, I meant to take 2 classifications up here, 2 secondary classifications. I'm going just to go back up and click on the arrow again. And this time I'm going to take local community-based services supports, and you can see it has added that. It also has subclassifications, and it's asking me, what do I want under that? And I'm going to say services for people with intellectual disability. Is my now, you know, I've picked 2 classifications, so is my second additional classification of less relevance to my charity than the first? And I'm going to say no. So it means that they're equally relevant. And next. And there we go. This is the final screen. It's a summary of what I've selected. I can check through that, print it off and show it to my trustees if I need to, that are confident I've done it. And then it's a matter of completing the declaration at the end. I am authorised to make the submission on behalf of the trustees. All the information has been approved by the trustees and I know the data protection. And that is it. Now say, for example, before I submit, I decided, oh, actually, I picked the wrong category there. Just click previous, straightforward, find the thing that's wrong, click on the bin and pick the one that's correct. It's as simple as that. You're next again and submit. And that is essentially it. And once that goes in, that will automatically update to the Register of Charities once it's your first submission. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and move back to my slide presentation again. Okay, so you should all be looking at the demo there again. Demo slide. So once you've submitted the form, this slide shows what it'll appear, how it'll appear on the Register of Charities. This is a different example to the one I've just used in the form, but you can see there the various fields that this charity has selected, and the classification will appear on the Overview tab of the Charities entry, just under the main object on the main tab. You'll also notice at the bottom that the entry contains an information statement. The classification is only an indication of the main activities of a charity, and it doesn't limit the types of activity which the charity can carry out. This will appear on every charity's entry with their classification information, and it's really just to ensure that users of the register are aware that the charity could be carrying out other activities to further their purpose, even if they don't seem to be included in their classification. And we thought that was important, that the public knew that there was a distinction. And this is how the advanced search will look on the register for anyone who wants to use the register to search for charities under their classification. So there'll be 2 new search options added, and it will mean that users can use governing form, they can use charitable purpose, they can use location, and they can use two lots of classification to identify charities. This hasn't been activated yet on the register and won't be until a significant number of charities have submitted their classification. The reason for not activating this search for now is twofold. Firstly, it's obviously to ensure that users are not misinformed if they use the advanced search feature when only a few charities have submitted their classification data. And secondly, and more importantly for yourselves, it's so as not to any way disadvantage charities which have not submitted their classification as quickly as other charities. But there will come a cut-off point whenever it will go live, and at that point, if your charity is not on the list, then you really need to get engaged. As I mentioned, we have a number of resources relating to charity classification on our website. That's charitiesregulator.ie. There's 3 documents in particular, the charity classification standard itself, the classification guide, and the how-to guide. The important documents for the trustees are the standard and the guide. The how-to guide should be all that your authorised filer needs to complete and submit the form once the classification has been decided by the trustees. So I suppose I'll finish up now with a necessary health warning about classification. And this is really important to note. As I said earlier, it's important to remember that classification is not an exact science, and it's very much open to interpretation and criticism from both those determining the classification and those using the information. And there's many examples of this, and I'm going to use a couple from outside of the charity field. For example, is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? We've all heard that old adage. Is a Jaffa cake a cake or a biscuit? In both of these examples, both responses are technically correct. It depends on why it's being classified by whom and by whom. And it demonstrates that there's no perfect standard, and charity classification is no different. So thank you for your time today. I hope the session has gone some way in reassuring you that classification should be a relatively straightforward process. And it's a once-off process too. Once you've done it, you'll probably never need to revisit it. I'd just like to end by encouraging you to get your classification agreed and submitted as soon as possible, and to spread the words to other charities and charity trustees who you may be in contact with. The more charities which submit their classification, the more relevant and usable the data becomes for all of us. I know we have a few minutes now to answer some of your questions, so I'm going to hand back to Ger, who is going to coordinate that. And once again, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mandy. and that was very informative. And just to say for those of you maybe who joined while we were in progress, we will be sending out a copy of the slides after this presentation, and the information that Mandy has given. There's a dedicated page on the website about classification, so a lot of the information will be there. But just ahead of that, I suppose, I mean, one of the most obvious questions, and I'm actually pushed to Madeline first, is this mandatory? I mean, do charities have to fill out the classification code?
No, it's not mandatory, and we don't feel it needs to be mandatory, because in this, no less than anything else, charity trustees and the people working with them are very good at filling out these documents, at providing this information, at making sure that the register is correct and up to date. So we trust that they will do it in this instance. Once you go in and you look and you see how simple it is, and I'd encourage you to do that, and once you do it, there are the benefits of having it up there on the register, as I say. So I think there's more benefit to it than downside. So no, it's not mandatory.
And I know Mandy again mentioned that she's encouraging charities to complete the form as soon as possible, but is there an ideal timeline that you have in mind?
Well, as Mandy said, we'd like to see it completed as soon as possible. And really that's because it's in the interest of the charities themselves, and we don't want to see anybody left behind. As Mandy alluded to there will be an advanced search function on the register. And we do anticipate that this new feature will be utilised by potential donors, potential volunteers, as well as researchers, but also funding agencies, grant giving bodies, philanthropy bodies. And if you're not in, you can't win. So really the idea is to do it as soon as possible. And I think if anybody who's here today goes in, has a look at the form, play around with it, because you can play around with it, familiarise yourself, I think that then you will take confidence to go away and discuss it as a board and go back and complete it formally. And I anticipate that there will be a lot of take up early in these coming months to get it into place for the new year.
And what was the thinking behind having only two primary, a map of two primary groups?
Well, in order for the data to be usable and to make sense, and for charities, I suppose, to be identifiable for those potential contributors as working in a particular area, it had to be limited in some way. Because as Mandy herself said, we all like to do the just in case, and keep on ticking. So it makes it harder in one sense, but at the end of the day, it means data is much more useful. And there's one thing I'd like to add to what Mandy has said about it, it being dependent on who's using the data, who's interpreting it. We all have different views and different answers. That's to say that in completing this, there is no right or wrong answer. So there is no worry about I'm getting something wrong, I'm doing the wrong thing, I'll be found out as not being doing this primarily. Really, it is just about that best fit. Put the best foot forward and select your categories, but there is no right or wrong answer.
And speaking of getting things right at schools, we also got our homework right. But what about them? Do they need to submit their classification?
Well, schools are in the fortunate position that because we clearly know what they are, if they have a roll number and they're on the register by virtue of having a roll number, which is a number assigned to them by the Department of Education, they will have their classification automatically populated under education and research. There is an option if they want to add to that in any of the secondary categories or the subcategories, and they can do that, but they need to be very careful not to change that primary category. So yeah, there's a little bit less homework ironically for the schools, but they can go in and add to that themselves.
And in terms of the standard that's in place now, we've got the 10 categories, we've got the subcategories. Is that it? Is there any plans to review it at any stage, or what's in place now, there forever?
Well, look, no less than anybody else, we put our best foot forward in pulling this together with the assistance of charities and other stakeholders. And we think it's what will work best. But no, we will review it. We will take feedback from those that are using the data, from the charities that are completing the form, from their experience maybe of being categorised in that way. And we will do a review, a formal review in 2 years, and then there'll be a normal periodic review after that. But I suppose we want to avoid the risk of maybe tinkering with it too much for the sake of it, trying to find perfection when it doesn't really exist. And then all we'll be doing is making it harder for charities and charity trustees who maybe have to go back and review stuff and change stuff. And then indeed the data, if it keeps changing, if you keep moving the goalposts, then it's not as useful as well. But there will be a formal review, and we welcome any feedback, and that will take place in 2 years' time.
And I know you mentioned that there's no right or wrong answer, but if I have, completed my form and I've submitted it, and I've made a mistake and I need to amend, how can I do that?
Well, simply what you do is you go in and you complete another form, and that will overwrite the one that you put in. Now, in the longer term, there will be a certain locking down of it. So it's not a case that, and I'm not suggesting that anybody would do this, but there won't be the facility there that every month or every quarter you could decide to change your primary classification and say there's something else. That's not what is intended to happen. But for the moment, to allow people to get used to the system and make those decisions as a board or a group of people as to what the best fit is, we are allowing you to go back in and overwrite it. But in time, it won't be as simple as doing it yourself for the primary categories. It might be for the more specialised ones underneath, and you may have to go through a sort of a submission process with us. But it will still be permissible. It's just it won't happen automatically. But for now, you're free to get on with it, and if you feel it doesn't reflect who you are, that you somehow were mistaken in how you selected categories, you can go back in and just complete another form.
I'm just looking at some of the questions that have come through, and I see there's one here which I think is a fair question. That if it's not mandatory for charities to complete the form, how can we be sure that ultimately enough will do it when we will have access to the information?
Well, we will keep encouraging. It's not mandatory at this time, and as I say, we have found charity trustees, employees and volunteers to be very good at completing these sort of tasks in relation to the register. So we've no reason to believe that they won't at this time. And as I say, there is a slight risk of them getting left behind if they don't, because it won't appear on the register. And again, as part of the review, this is something that we can consider. But I think we have to be fair to everybody and try to work in partnership with it. And as I say, I think when people see how simple the mechanics of it are, they'll be quicker to do it.
And the benefits, because I know that what we're certainly seeing from a communications point of view is we're seeing that more and more people are actually using the search the register function, and the information will be up there. So from a charity's perspective, the more information they have up there that regarding their charity, the more information is actually available to a donor, to a member of the public, to a journalist, in terms of,
well, exactly. And for the smaller charities, I mean, there's a huge, if we've 11,000 charities and you think about how many of them how many of them are household names, or you might know the ones in your local community. You don't necessarily know the other ones, or you won't know the niche ones or the very small ones. So how can you find them if you want to either volunteer or you want to contribute in some other way, or you're a grant giving body? And the reality is, if you search the register now, it's very limited, because the charity purposes by virtue of which you register and which you have to have in order to be a charity, well, they're not really that meaningful in terms of explaining what you're doing. So you should be able to find a category to commit to and say that's what you do. And then that's so much more easy to search on the register and to understand, oh, so that's what they're doing. Yeah, that's fine. I actually want to do something with that sort of a charity, and I can give them money. And otherwise, how would you have found them? So we do think it'll make a difference to the searchability of the register, which would be a huge benefit to a lot of charities.
There's another question here. The categories look very familiar. Have we already been using them, for example, when filing an annual report?
Well, I see Mandy's dying to jump in there. I'm going to let her.
I think some of them, yes, would be very familiar because it is very closely aligned to the international classification of not-for-profits and third sector organisations, which as I said is widely used both in charities and not-for-profit sector across the world. So what we've done essentially mirrors that very closely. So some of the titles would be familiar with a little bit of tweaking to make them maybe more up-to-date or more modern or more for an Irish context. But also a lot of the categories will align with terminology that is used in our annual reports, particularly around the beneficiaries and the types of activities that your charity is carrying out. So yes, some of the categories definitely are familiar, others would be less so. I just want to pick up on something else that Madeleine said about why it's important. I had a query the other day from someone who was actually trying to find out by charities that were involved in environmental research. And I was trying to assist the individual to isolate some of the information. And it was well nigh impossible, because when we searched the register, and in the back office here in the Charities Regulator, we obviously have access to more information than what the public has. But even using that, and even using buzzwords and search words, I couldn't categorically stand over the fact that I possibly find every charity that was involved in environmental research. So from that point of view, that was an absolute working example of why it's important, because I didn't spend a huge amount of time, but maybe a half an hour trying to isolate a number of charities for this gentleman that he was looking for. And in the end, I just had to say, sorry, I can't answer your query. And that should have been something that was very, very simple to do. So having this classification to hopefully help us to do that.
Okay, I don't know if anybody's any more questions that we've answered several other questions that have come through on the live option. Just to say that the slides will be available, and there's also a dedicated section on the website for classification, and it's broken down into various sections so that it should hopefully answer all the questions that you have. But
sorry, Ger, I did see another question earlier, and I jotted it down. No, you're okay. Just somebody was asking there about whether you could see the list of categories before you go into filling the form. All of that basic detail is on the front page of the form, and equally you can go in and play around with it and save it, do a dummy one before you go back. But also there's excellent guidance done by Mandy, a guidance document on the website, and that goes through the categories in detail and how they break down, and has the narrative explaining what they are. So you could, if you're a little bit more uncomfortable about it, you could go in and look at all of that first, maybe have your discussion and then go into the form.
And if, having done all of that and looked at the guidance and looked at the slides, and if you still have a question, you can always email us here at the Charities Regulator, and the email address will be info@charitiesregulator.ie, and put classification in the subject heading, and the email will get to Mandy.